Good day and welcome to FSMA Fridays. Today we're going to be digging into the topic of pet food manufacturers implementing the Preventive Controls Rule for animal food. But first, for those new to this webcast, I'll provide you with a little background on how we run these sessions. Our focus is to touch on recent changes, activities, and related news about the FDA and FSMA, and to discuss industry trends that we've seen as FSMA has taken shape over the years. It's also an opportunity to hear and learn from the leaders in this industry with global food and beverage consulting company, the Acheson Group. The experts at TAG co-sponsor these sessions, and they're great partners to work with, not just with our clients, but in contributing to this webcast as a service to the food industry community. And on the software side is where we do our part. At Safety Chain, we have a food quality management system for food safety, quality assurance, and supplier compliance. Before we get into what's new with FSMA and dig into this month's topic, we have just a few housekeeping tips regarding today's webcast. Our format is pretty informal. These are part training, part conversation. We find that the topics we cover on FSMA Fridays tend to generate lots of audience questions. Feel free to ask them anytime during the session by submitting your questions using the question and answer panel in GoToWebinar. We'll monitor those behind the scenes and save them for the end. If you have a question that's maybe a little too specific or we come up against time constraints, we might choose to take that offline after the event, but we do try to get to every question and answer as many as we can. You'll notice that in the interest of everyone's privacy, the panelists are the only ones displayed during this webcast. The number one question we always get is, will this be recorded? And the answer is yes. We'll share a copy of the recording along with a slide deck afterwards. So if you prefer to sit back and just enjoy the presentation, rest assured you can do that and then watch the replay at your leisure. The last detail before we get started is that if you have any audio issues, we'll do our best to help you. But usually the best way to solve any audio or connection problems is either changing your audio source. So you can either use your computer or you can use the phone or just log out and log back in. That usually solves the problem. So again, as I mentioned, today we'll touch on a few FSMA updates, but the real focus here is digging into the details of today's topic, followed up by a little bit of Q&A at the end. Today we're joined by Christopher Snabes, Senior Manager of Food Safety at the Acheson Group. Mr. Snabes has joined us for FSMA Fridays many times in the past, and we're happy to have him back with us today. He's a PCQI lead instructor for human food, animal food, and foreign supplier verification program. Welcome back, Christopher. Happy Friday.
Thank you, Jennifer. Happy Friday to everybody out there. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah. Okay, to kick things off, let's talk about the latest FSMA news. I understand that you have some FSMA updates to share.
Hi, yes, just a couple of announcements were released since last month. About a week ago, the Food and Drug Deputy Commissioner for Foods and Veterinary Medicine, Dr. Stephen Ostroff, announced that he's retiring on January 5th, and he will be replaced by Frank Yanis, who many of you know is currently the Vice President of Food Safety and Health for Walmart. Frank Yanis will join FDA next month, but will not have the same title as Ostroff. Instead, he will be FDA's Deputy Commissioner for Food Policy and Response. And this is in part due to the agency's currently reorganization, which is now underway, setting up an Office of Food Policy and Response to focus on food safety. Two guidances were released last week as well, both in regards to the produce rule. A 152-page guidance for the standards for the growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of produce for human consumption was released. And accompanying it was a 71-page guide to minimize food safety hazards of fresh-cut produce. As with past guidance releases, the comment period is now open for the next 6 months. And in addition, just this week, it was announced that there will be 4 open public meetings that can be attended. 2 will be held in November, and 2 will be held in December. And that is all I have for the latest FSMA updates from the FDA.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for that update, Christopher. Let's move on to today's focus, which is pet food manufacturers implementing the Preventive Controls Rule for animal food. I'm going to hand it over to you again, and just let me know when you'd like me to move the slides forward.
Thank you, Jennifer. As Jennifer mentioned, this will be focusing mostly on the pet food manufacturer side of the animal food rule. Some quick background information about the rule. FSMA mandated that pet food must now be produced in a safe manner, which is a new concept for pet food manufacturers prior to FSMA. Pet food manufacturers have to implement current good manufacturing practices, which was also a new concept for pet food manufacturers. They have to implement the preventive controls. Again, that's a new concept for pet food manufacturers. In order to help the pet food industry come up to speed with all these various new rules, they decided to implement it on a staggered approach. What they required was current GMPs be implemented first, and then they gave you a year to implement your preventive controls. Large and small pet food manufacturers were required to implement the CGMPs and preventive controls by this past September. Very small manufacturers had to implement their current good manufacturing practices by this past September. And they have until September of 2019 to fully implement the preventive controls. Next slide, please. For a lot of food companies, pet food manufacturers, if they were not familiar with FSMA, this was, for some companies, a daunting task. For a lot of other companies, they're very familiar with general HACCP principles to begin with, so implementing the FSMA regulations was not very difficult. What has to be done? Well, immediately the first thing that had to be done is if a pet food manufacturer did not have any GMPs in place, they had to establish them. So they had to come up with training. They had to learn how to document the training, document what the GMP procedures were, and then implementing the training and implementing the GMPs on a daily practice. Then the second step was to create the food safety plan. The food safety plan must be written by, or the writing of the food safety plan overseen by, a preventive controls qualified individual, or a PCQI, and it has to be for animal food. A person who's a human food PCQI is not necessarily equivalent to an animal food PCQI. So, for example, if you attended an FSPCA course for human food training under one program, it does not mean it's equivalent for animal food and vice versa. There are differences between the two programs. Currently, there is not an FDA-based animal food safety plan builder software, just as there is for the human food. I have not heard anything coming down the pipeline for the animal food, but again, that could change at any time. Next slide, please. So how do you develop the food safety plan? If you listened in last month, we spent a lot of time talking about the hazard analysis being the crux of your food safety plan, the most important part of the food safety plan. And similarly with the animal food, again, the hazard analysis is the heart of your food safety plan. So what do you have to do? You have to take into consideration all known and reasonably foreseeable uses of the pet food. So, for example, do humans come in contact with the pet food? That's a foreseeable use. Or are you producing a pet food ingredient that will be further processed by another pet food manufacturer? And if you are, will that pet food manufacturer use that ingredient and take care of any hazards that might be associated with it? Or could it be used directly? What would be the foreseeable use of that ingredient? You should spend a large majority of your time initially on the hazard analysis before you write your food safety plan. You should have a hazard analysis done on your ingredients and on each step of the process. So, for example, are you introducing a hazard or are you controlling for a hazard? If so, how are you doing it, or what is being introduced and how will you control it? Once you have determined what the hazards are and how they have to be controlled, that helps you with the rest of your food safety plan in determining whether or not a program will be a prerequisite program or a preventive control. What do you need to have in preparing your hazard analysis? You should have multiple team members from your company with various backgrounds. So, for example, obviously you would want to have somebody very familiar with the production process, somebody from supply chain or procurement, somebody from sanitation, somebody from maintenance, quality assurance, QA, etc. All those different various backgrounds can help you analyze each step of the hazard analysis and give you a big picture or a full picture of what may or may not be either introduced or controlled. As you're doing this, you're going to realize it's going to have to be revised several times before it's fully functional. So be prepared to have multiple edits. And it's important to remember that each facility has to have a hazard analysis specific to that facility as part of the facility's food safety plan. So if you are associated with a company that has multiple facilities and there is a quote-unquote corporate plan, your hazard analysis and your food safety plan has to be tailored specifically to what is happening at your facility. Next slide, please. What do we have to take into consideration when we're talking about the hazard analysis? Again, if you're familiar with HACCP, this is not a new concept. If you're not familiar with HACCP, for some companies, this is a whole new concept to take into consideration. You have to consider all biological, chemical, and physical risks or hazards that may occur. One thing to remember is that animal food is completely exempt from any allergen hazard, which is fall underneath the chemical hazard. So you don't have to worry about any allergens. An interesting perspective about the hazard analysis deals specifically with the species that will be receiving the food. And because of that, your hazard analysis has to take into consideration specific hazards associated with that species. So, for example, if you are producing a cat food, you have to have a certain level of thiamine in that cat food. An inadequate level of thiamine for cat food is detrimental to the health of the cat. So if you have producing the cat food, you have to make sure you have some kind of control in place that will ensure there is the proper level of thiamine in that cat food. In addition, as with the human food, you have to consider any radiological hazards that might exist and any economically motivated adulteration hazards that lead to a food safety issue. For example, in the pet food industry, it is very well known that melamine has been supplied as an ingredient. Melamine is an EMA that causes detrimental harm to various species. So if you are producing a cat food that might have an ingredient that historically is known and been swapped out with or diluted with melamine, you now have to call that out in your hazard analysis and state how you will control for that potential EMA from getting into your supply chain. The last thing you have to do as you're doing your hazard analysis, you'll see that you'll have come up with certain preventive controls that need to be implemented, and now you'll have to implement those preventive controls based on the hazards called out in hazard analysis. Next slide, please. Remaining parts of the food safety plan is quite complex. There's quite a lot of things. However, they are called out as needed based on the hazard analysis that we did earlier. Other parts of the plan are mandatory, such as your facility information. Your hazard analysis will help you determine what process preventive controls you need versus other preventive controls, such as sanitation or supply chain applied preventive controls. And then there's also the preventive control management components, how you will do the monitoring. What corrective actions do you have in place in case a preventive control were to fail? What will your steps be? As well as allowing for corrections. You also have to state how your preventive controls are verified, and that's done through validation and verification of implementation and effectiveness. It should be reminded to people out there and to the animal pet food manufacturers that validation of a preventive control is only for a process preventive control. So, for example, if you have an extruder and you're extruding food product and the extruder imparts a certain temperature that has a 5-log kill documentation for a biological hazard, that is a process preventive control. and a validation study will need to be done and conducted on that process preventive control. Other management components is mandatory now is a recall plan. You have to have a recall plan. And of course, you have to have procedures in place for reanalysis, collecting your records, reviewing your records, and appropriate signatures. Next slide, please. What are some optional things that could be in a food safety plan? Well, obviously, you can have a description of who's on your food safety team. I mentioned earlier when you were doing your hazard analysis, you would like to have a varied backgrounds of people helping you. Those people typically are part of your food safety team. A facility overview of in general, what happens at your facility. A lot of times when an FDA investigator will come in, they'll say, what do you do at this facility? And you can have a written overview, a simple paragraph or two of what happens at your facility. And of course, a flow diagram. Technically, a flow diagram is not required with the food safety plan. However, I've yet to see any business in the food industry, pet food or animal food, that doesn't have some type of a food safety flow diagram. Flow diagram is very beneficial for you. And it's highly recommended that you have a flow diagram if you don't. But again, it's not mandatory. Next slide, please. What have we seen in the field? This is some real life observations that the Acheson Group has seen when we go to help pet food manufacturers. A lot of pet food manufacturers determine, based on their hazard analysis, that they have a hazard that needs to be controlled. And some pet food manufacturers have improperly thought through thinking that any hazard can only be controlled by a preventive control. And that's not necessarily true. So, for example, if you have pest control in your facility, that's typically part of a prerequisite program. It's not elevated to the higher standard of a preventive control. So we try to tell facilities you don't want to have a preventive control for every single step, because many of the hazards can fall underneath a prerequisite program or an operational program, and it's not elevated to that preventive control state. So we've seen some companies having too many preventive controls that were not necessary, or they were calling them a preventive control when they could have been called a prerequisite program. Another item that we've seen in the field is failure to take into account post-process preventive control exposure hazards. So, for example, while you're doing your hazard analysis, let's say after the product is produced, it then goes through a post-kill step where something is applied, be it a spraying of a fat, an oil, a flavor. When that happens in that area, typically you have to take into account a hazard that could be introduced at that step. Usually, things that we think about are environmental pathogens. Or is the item that you're applying at the post-kill step from a supplier? If it's from a supplier, are they ensuring that the item that you're applying is safe? For example, has it been evaluated for any biological or chemical hazards? If it has not, and you are applying it, then you have to figure out how can you ensure that that post-kill addition is safe. Do you have to add another preventive control? Or if it is coming from a supplier, have you elevated your supply chain to a preventive control? And how do you verify that that supplier is giving you something safe? Another thing we see commonly is the validation. Where is the validation study for the process preventive control? Was it an in-house study? Did you have an outside entity come in and do the study? How do you validate it? And there are some companies we've seen that have the validation study, and they forget a very simple step, and that is to ensure that the preventive control qualified individual has made sure that validated study is appropriate for the food facility. And how do they do that? They review it, and they need to sign it and date it. It's a simple step, and most facilities I've been to, the PCQI has reviewed the validation study, but they forgot to sign and date it. Next slide, please. Other things that we've seen is poor preventive control implementation in the raw pet food industry. So, for example, a minute ago I was talking about a supply chain preventive control. Some raw pet food companies we've seen have not done a full vetting of their suppliers, and they're assuming that the food that they are getting from, or the ingredients they're getting from a supplier, is completely safe without going through either a full hazard analysis of that ingredient or without fully having some documentation that that pet food supplier is giving them a food or an ingredient that is safe. Again, that relates directly back to the hazard analysis. Other things that we've seen in the raw pet food industry is that sanitation controls that are being applied either need to be raised to a preventive control, or if they are raised to a preventive control, they're not fully implemented properly, meaning they're not taking into consideration where could, say, for example, an environmental pathogen hide or lurk in a piece of equipment. Are you fully breaking down a grinder or a slicer, making sure that there is no areas or a niche where an environmental pathogen can take residence? We've seen it a couple times in the raw pet food industry. Another thing we see is another simple signature, and that is to have a signature page of the entire food safety plan where it is signed and dated by the PCQI and the highest ranking officer of that facility. That is required. Many times, not just the animal pet food industry, but the human food industry, this is one of the most simplest steps that is overlooked, is the final signature. And of course, in almost every facility we've been to, we see some form of a GMP deficiency. The animal food industry is no exception. The animal food industry implementing GMPs, as I said at the beginning of this, it was a new concept. So what do we see? We see a failure to properly train, document, implement, and enforce the current good manufacturing practices. Many times, a company will go through really good training for the employees, and it's documented that they've gone through GMP training. They've been trained on how to do the GMPs, but when it comes to actually implementing the GMPs, things go to the wayside over time. And so that can fall back to the supervisor of the area making sure that those employees are properly following GMPs. And we see that quite frequently. Next slide, please. And I believe now we're ready for some Q&As.
Yes, we do have some questions coming in from the audience. The first question, do you need to have a separate food safety plan for each facility if manufacturing and packaging is done at different locations associated with the organization?
So you have to have a food safety plan if I understand the question right. If it is just a warehouse, I'm assuming that's what the person is asking about. If it is just a warehouse, they still have to determine if a food safety plan is needed and go through the same hazard analysis. And that really comes into play if anything is stored either for temperature related for safety or if anything is exposed. If everything comes into the warehouse and leaves the warehouse packaged and is not repackaged, then what is required under the food safety plan is greatly diminished.
Okay. Another question, do animal foods need to meet the requirements of the Sanitation Transportation Act?
That's a good question. They still have to be transported safely. The ingredients coming in have to come in on, especially if they're coming from a human food facility, because that's very common in the animal pet food industry. But those vehicles and vessels and containers have to be clean. And so, yes, those portions of the sanitary transport rule do fall to take effect.
Okay. Another question. What is the definition of a large, small, and very small pet food manufacturers?
Sure. So the FDA came up with a generic list of those three. So it's a common question to get quite a bit. So a large facility is any facility that has 500 or more full-time equivalent employees. And that is based on all companies within a corporation. So, for example, if you are a pet food manufacturer and there's only 45 employees at your facility, however, you're owned by an entity that makes other food and there's over 500 employees total, then that small facility that only has 45 employees now goes into the large bucket. So it's 500 full-time equivalent employees on a complete company-wide basis. A small business is less than 500 for all entities involved with that corporation. A very small business is a little bit different, and that's a business that has averaging less than $2.5 million for a calendar year in sales of animal food, plus the market value of any animal food manufactured, processed, packed, or held without sale, meaning your inventory. So if you have any unsold inventory, you have to count that as part of your $2.5 million.
Okay. I think this is the last question we can cover before wrapping up. And for those of you who have any other folks who have submitted questions, we'll take those offline and have Christopher follow up with you. But the last one is, can I be an animal PCQI without taking an FSPCA course?
Yes. If you can document that they have either the education, training, or experience, or combination thereof, necessary to manufacture, process, pack, or hold safe animal food, and can understand the FSMA requirements, then they can meet it. The key is, though, it has to be documented. And that's usually done via a resume and any supporting documents that that person has in their personnel file, including any training records. So that is another way you can meet it. The key there is it has to be documented, and they have to be able to understand how it applies to FSMA and FSMA language.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much for answering. We had a lot of questions today. As we wrap up, I'd like to make a few reminders. We do have a FSMA Fridays LinkedIn group, and if you're not a member yet, please seek it out next time you're on LinkedIn and join us. Christopher,
thank you very much.
Oh, sure. Christopher and his team at Acheson Group are experts on FSMA and can be a tremendous help in this area, whether it's around the rules and regulations or building out your plans and dealing with compliance issues. You can check them out at achesongroup.com. And then on the technology and tools side, with the consultation and implementation that our partners over at TAG do, we're able to complement that on the software side and make the process of compliance a lot more seamless, a lot faster, and more efficient for your company. So if you're looking for technology to help complement the work that you're already doing around compliance, whether it's food safety, GFSI compliance, quality assurance, or supplier management, you can learn more about our solutions at safetychain.com. And we'll just wrap things up by telling you about a few more resources. Again, we'll be sharing the recording probably early next week. I'd like to remind you that we host another educational webinar series called Beyond Compliance, where we bring on guest presenters to explore various topics of interest to food quality and safety practitioners. There's no cost for those webinars, and they're a great opportunity to learn from leaders in the industry. We also host monthly demo days, and you can find all the details for our next demo day on our website at safetychain.com. And finally, a great resource for FSMA compliance news between sessions is TAG's newsletter. So go ahead and check that out on the TAG website. Next month, FSMA Fridays will be on November 30th, so mark that on your calendar and we'll send out our usual reminders. And with that, I would like to thank all of you for joining us and continuing to support this series. And Christopher, thank you so very much for putting together a terrific presentation today. We look forward to having you come back again soon.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, everybody, for listening.
Great. Thanks. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. We will see you next month, and have a great weekend.